Hi and welcome to Tales from the Gulag, and first thing you may have noticed is gone is my Where's Wally polo shirt, gone is my I Know Where Wally Is polo shirt, and now I'm in my warm, snuggly dressing gown because this morning it's a cold, dreary Albany morning with winter just a matter of a few weeks away. The temperature has dropped noticeably, so at least this way I'm snugly and warm to an extent while I'm doing today's tales. Now, the topic for today is Deal or No Deal, Clive Palmer and the Liberals. But hang on, I'm a bit confused here. I wrote this piece originally a few days ago when the debate was on over the proposed preferences deal between Clive Palmer's United Australia Party and the Liberals, whether or not such a deal should go ahead. Should the Liberals make a deal or not? Back then it wasn't a done deal, but then I thought I heard on the radio news that the deal had been done, and then a Google search indicated that that was so. So I sat on it and began mentally rewriting my piece, and now it sounds like it hasn't been made, so I'm a bit confused. So perhaps the best thing I can do is go ahead with my original piece as if it is still up for grabs and let you just take my stuff as a general principle and in the light of events as they happen to turn out. Followers of Tales would know by now that I'm no fan of the Australian Labor Party, and I would certainly not be pleased with a victory for them in a few weeks' time. But the proposed preferences deal between Clive Palmer's United Australia Party and Scott Morrison's Liberal Party illustrates well a good part of the reason I'm far from ready to endorse the Liberals either. But that's going to be a topic for another Tales from the Gulag. To be blunt, ever since that one time that I voted Liberal back in the 1970s, the choice was still between a kick in the teeth and a smack in the head. Let's have a look at the preferences deal to show why. For non-Australians who don't know how we vote, we practice preferential voting. You don't just put a tick on a ballot paper for the party or person that we want. No, all candidates are listed and we're expected to number each one according to our preference. The reason for this is shown by looking at countries who don't have the system, how they work. We usually have to have repeated votes until one candidate comes out the winner. With Australia's system, it is like having a runoff all in the one day. In round one, no candidate comes out with a majority, and so the loser of that round is eliminated and the second preferences are counted, and so it goes on until we have a winner. For one thing, it saves constantly having to go and cast a vote, but it does also mean that if you backed a loser, your vote still has some value, and I think that is a good thing. For another thing, and this is usually lost to most, while there are two major parties, one of whom it seems will inevitably form a government, sans a major shift in our political landscape, I believe that if enough people vote for one of the minor parties, it can be a signal to the majors what people really think on a number of issues. A case in point goes back years ago when Pauline Hanson formed One Nation on an anti-immigration ticket, and the majors browned their pants because she actually did well for a new minor party. Now, to Clive Palmer, to me, he is still a largely unknown entity. I know that he is a wealthy mining magnate who has formed his own pro-Australia party, and that to me seems like a pretty good thing. He is largely criticised for his treatment of his workers, and I recall one Donald Trump having those same sort of criticisms levelled at him. But it is clear that the United Australian Party is out to win seats. For, I don't know, about the last 6 months, every other time I have opened up a video on YouTube, there is an ad from Clive Palmer's United Australian Party. It's clear to me that they are out to be a serious alternative to the two majors. One common theme of these Clive Palmer ads is his criticism of our economic policies, which have the impact of giving communist China undue influence in our affairs. I think these are valid criticisms of both major parties, and Labor in particular. It is one of these Clive Palmer ads that alerted me to the Cape Preston iron mining project and the recruitment of 500 Communist Party members to the ALP. I checked them out and, blow me down, he is right. Why? The Chinese Communist Party is not made of nice people and never has been. Some facts. From the very beginning, they have been a violent gang of thugs responsible for the deaths of tens, possibly 100 million, according to one author that I read once upon a time, through civil war, through starvation, through the torture and imprisonment of political opponents, not to mention, say, the Cultural Revolution. Their aim has been and still remains the global exportation of communism around the globe. In the 70s, the Nixon administration in America pulled a strategic coup by finally weaning China away from the Soviet Union. Well, actually, the rift was there for years, but Nixon finalised the deal and, bit by bit, China began to open up to the outside world. Some freedoms were granted to Chinese citizens, the economy liberalised, and foreigners could again trade there. But we need to remember a name that their government would rather forget: Tiananmen Square, a prominent open public place within Beijing, where the imperial government used to have its palaces. Now, back in 1989, when Chinese students staged a massive protest in that square in Beijing and also in Shanghai, and they began demanding some political freedoms, the government responded with tanks. That's the Chinese party that Clive Palmer is talking about. Over the past few decades, we have cultivated an image of that government as authoritarian, but basically benign. That's not true, and it never has been. They have always been totalitarian and expansionistic. Their human rights record has always been appalling, but now Xi Jinping has powers that Mao could only have dreamed of. There is massive repression of Falun Gong, which has gone on for years, but also repression against Christians and also the Muslims in China has increased. Years ago, I was told by a Chinese pastor that over there you are not considered a real pastor until you have done some time in prison. And that was actually before the recent crackdown. Opponents of a preference deal between the United Australia Party and the Liberals do so because they are afraid that the UAP is strongly critical of the Chinese government, and the Chinese government will be offended and probably won't be so easy for us to deal with trade-wise. And they fear that such a deal will alienate the Chinese, on whom our economy increasingly depends. It's also interesting to note that these critics are the same ones who oppose a preference deal with one nation. Not so much because they care about racism, really, but they simply want to split the Conservative vote so that they can win. And that, I would suggest, is the real issue behind this debate. Here is a thought. What puts a strain on our relationship between us and China are things like their appalling human rights record. True, in the world of realpolitik, we often deal with those with whom we don't like. But let's go on. I think China's illegal artificial islands in the South China Sea strain our relationship. What about their desire to expand into the Indian Ocean so that they can be a global power? What about unfair trade practices like tariffs and the theft of intellectual property? I, for one, think that China actually deserves a bit of offence. They deserve to be called out for their illegal actions. Pandering and appeasement do not work when you are dealing with thugs and bullies, as these people always have been. So I, for one, say, do the preferences and screw the Chinese. As Trump's trade policies show, they are just dependent on us as we are of them. Maybe we should join in standing up to the Chinese and call them to a higher standard of conduct. Further, I don't believe that by giving your preferences to this or that party, you necessarily endorse everything that party says. It simply means that there is more agreement between you and this party and the other one. Giving your preferences to Clive Palmer does not necessarily mean that you're planning to go to war with China. Not that I've ever heard Clive Palmer propose that. Giving your preferences to Pauline Hanson does not necessarily mean that you endorse reopening Auschwitz. Again, not that I have ever heard Pauline propose that one either. My point is that both of these parties are enough of a threat to the mainstream that they have attracted their own strong smear campaigns that paint them as greater extremists than they actually are. Why? Because it's useful to Labor and the left to split the Conservative vote so that they can win and take Australia down the communist, leftist, globalist path. At the end of the day, whatever major parties do with their preferences, it is only their recommendations to the voter. I, for one, will give my preferences my way, and you will do your preferences your way at the end of the day. For me, Labor will be at the bottom, Liberal somewhere in the middle, and yet above the various loony leftist crackpot parties, and above them, well, Australian Conservatives at the top, followed by, I haven't made up my mind completely, but I'm prepared to say, that both Clive and Pauline will be above both major parties. So there you go. Meanwhile, to the Liberals, my sage advice for what it is worth is to do the preference deals with both parties if you see fit. And then have the balls to be prepared to stand up for why you did so and argue your case. Then you will probably have a better chance at electoral success than you would by trying to be Labor light.